convinced 100 people to do this wacky diet for 90 days. And of those 100 people, almost all of them, they lost like 30 pounds on average over 90 days. Their joint pain got better. Their guts got better. Their mental health got better. Their libido got better. Their waist size went down 8 centimeters. Their resting heart rate went down like 10 beats per minute.
What's up, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls around the world? I'd like to welcome you back to the Real Talk with Zuby podcast. On today's episode, we have got on Dr. Shawn Baker. He is the founder of Revero and author of The Carnivore Diet. Welcome to the show.
Zuby, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. I know I've been following you for a while on Twitter, and I am impressed with your, I was first saw you breaking the world record for the female deadlift, and I was a little jealous I didn't get a chance to do that, but congratulations on that. Although I think it's going to not count anymore, unfortunately, because I think that's kind of gone by the wayside. But anyway, good stuff. What did you pull, by the way? I don't remember what the number was.
The video that went viral was 230 kilos.
230 kilos. So
230 kilos. Yeah, like
515 or something like that.
Something like that. Yeah. My
PB, I gotta convert to pounds.
Yeah, my PB was 275, which is about 606, I think. So that was like that's my all-time best. But the video that went viral was 230 kilos. So we're back down to two genders, it looks like, after that time. But I'm happy to have made my mark on the world.
Good for you, man. Awesome. Well, thanks. Yeah, I think my best. I hit 350 back in the day, so that's my best. But
that's awesome.
Still can hit okay for an old guy.
This episode is brought to you by Sambroza, the best way to get your 8 hours of rest. If, like me, you sometimes struggle with nighttime restlessness and allergies, then Sambroza Night Syrup could be a game changer for you. Sambroza contains a natural base of 7 organic herbs, honey, and a small amount of antihistamine. It's effective and soothing with no harsh chemicals, no high fructose corn syrup, and no artificial flavors or dyes. I've been using Sambroza for several months now, and I can personally vouch for its effectiveness when it comes to improving my quality of rest at night. I also love the fact that they're a family-owned company who share my values of faith, freedom, and integrity. My listeners can try Sambroza today and get 10% off by going to sambroza.com/Zuby10. That's SAMBROSA.com/Zuby10 for 10% off your order. Try Sambroza today and wake up ready to embrace life's opportunities. Go to sambroza.com/Zuby10 and try it out. Well, Shawn, I know some of my listeners will probably be familiar with you and your work, but a lot of them won't be. So I've given a very brief intro, but please introduce yourself to my audience.
Yeah, so I'm an orthopedic surgeon by training. So I spent several decades practicing conventional medicine. Spent time overseas in Afghanistan as a combat trauma surgeon, which was kind of an interesting period of time. But I got into medical school and into medicine with the thought of I'm going to cure disease and help people, and that really isn't what the deal is. I mean, we've gotten to where we medicine has kind of devolved into this symptom management stuff, put people on medicine for the rest of their life, do a few procedures here and there. We don't really practice healthcare, at least in the vision that I had when I started. And so I kind of, at some point, kind of realized that maybe we can do a better job. And I remember, it was kind of almost by chance, when you're an orthopedic surgeon and you're replacing joints, you end up taking care of a lot of sick people, a lot of overweight people. And there was a period of time where the local community I was part of was saying, we've got a lot of these obese people that are needing knee replacements, and their rates of complication are just higher. It's just part of the deal. When you're obese, you have higher blood clot rates, you have higher infection rates, you have kind of worse rehab. So we're trying to do something to change that. And so the consensus was, hey, we're going to just stop offering surgery to people that are really obese until they can lose weight. And, I think in general, that was probably a good thing, but there was no sort of like, this is how you do it. Like this, how to make people lose weight, because it's very complicated. A lot of people struggle with that. And I just happened personally have gone on this kind of low carb journey myself, because I was probably at that time, I'm 58 now. So I was probably early 40s, and just kind of like, I'm losing weight, using a low carb version, kind of a ketogenic style diet. And notice for the first time in my life, I wasn't really hungry, which is weird, because I'd walked around at like, just shy of 300 pounds for about 20 years. Big, strong, athletic guy, ate a lot of food. And I noticed, well, I'm not hungry. This is weird. I'm used to being like eating all the time. And then so I started having some of my patients adopt that, which is cool. A lot of them would lose weight. But the really interesting thing to me as a surgeon was people that had bone on bone arthritis that were on the schedule for a knee replacement would come back, 2, 3 weeks later, and they would tell me that my knee doesn't hurt anymore. And I was like, well, that's weird. If your knee doesn't hurt, well, guess what? You don't need the surgery. And so I this went on for about a year. And finally I was like, this is something that's pretty interesting. And I had done thousands of operations at that point. It was kind of routine. It's like anything. You think it's really cool and interesting, but if you've done it 1,000 times, like, well, it's just like changing a tire or something like that. You do it enough times, it becomes routine. And so I was more excited about the fact that I was canceling surgeries. Now, that wasn't as exciting for the hospital because the administration was like, we want the money, you know. So I came to realize that it wasn't so much about let's help people. It was like let's generate money for the hospital, for the business. And so that kind of changed my perception of what medicine is. And so I eventually got out of that. Said I just ethically am more excited about helping people, change their lives, with lifestyle. And so that's where I've got I wrote this book called The Carnivore Diet. I ran into a bunch of crazy people eating all meat. I thought they were nuts, like everybody does. Well, you guys just eat meat. Isn't that nuts? What about scurvy? What about where are your vegetables? Where's all your fiber? But the reality is that these people were really, seeing dramatic improvements in their health. And so, I was exposed to this long enough to where I was, pretty convinced that there is something here. And so I started, I adopted it myself. I went on this all crazy all meat diet. I just felt healthier. I mean, I was at that time I was 50 and I was like, this is, the healthiest I felt since I was probably 30. I mean, I really felt like all the because when you've been lifting, when you're an athlete, when you lift, you get beat up and you get injuries and those things accumulate over time. And then all of a sudden you just don't feel so good. And then you don't want to train. And I remember I'd had knee pain for, I don't know, 15 years, some quad tendonitis. And that went away for the first time. And I was like, this is really interesting. So then I could run and jump and play and do all the things I did when I was in my 20s and early 30s. And so that was really cool for me. And so, we just got to where I convinced 100 people. I remember this is back in 2017. I convinced 100 people to do this wacky diet for 90 days. And of those 100 people, almost all of them, they lost like 30 pounds on average over 90 days. Their joint pain got better. Their guts got better. Their mental health got better. Their libido got better. Their waist size went down 8 centimeters. Their resting heart rate went down like 10 beats per minute. So this is back in 2017. And then of course, Rogan heard about it. I went on Rogan and then, everybody thought I was a crazy person. Now a lot more people knew how crazy I was. And so, but I mean, we press with that. And so now at this point, we've got, a number of studies in the literature that have shown the benefit of this, with things like inflammatory bowel disease, whether it be Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. We've seen people with like mental health disorders like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety gotten better. We've got reports on anorexia getting better. Right now, we're writing up studies on multiple sclerosis and then psoriasis. So we've got all this data coming out that shows that this can be a very effective intervention tool for all kinds of health issues. And, I don't know if you saw, there was a recent survey that came out in Europe. They looked at 5 countries and they're seeing for the first time in decades, people's meat consumption, red meat consumption is going up. In Sweden, it's like 25% of the people are eating way more meat. And that's because they're starting to realize this is, I think the message is finally getting through that meat is actually a health food. And I'm certainly the first guy that will tell you not everybody needs to be on a carnivore diet. I, I think it has a limited role for people that are sick. Now, if somebody wants to, get a tattoo on their forehead and call themselves Carnivore Carl, and that's whatever, that's fine. They can do it if they want to. But I'm just, as a physician, I'm the guy saying, hey, look, this is a viable and a very effective treatment tool. And some people know they might do it 3 months, 6 months, maybe a year. And then from there, they can see where they want to go. Some people, it's just so easy and they enjoy it and, simplifies thing and they can keep doing it. And that's fine too. But as obviously we've had a huge election. And I know you kind of have, you've got, when I follow you, it's a lot of public commentary on the state of the world, right? A lot of things you like to talk about. And as you know, there's been a big shift with Trump getting elected, this whole Maha movement, people starting to sort of like question things, which I think it's good. It's good to question things. I mean, it's like if you just assume everybody's always right and telling you the truth, you're in for a big awakening later. And so when you disabuse people of that sort of, this isn't necessarily the truth, we can question those things and we get some very interesting results, which is what we're seeing right now. So it's been really cool. So yeah, we started this company Revero. We now are, I think we're right now in 48 of the 58 of the 50 states. Yeah, I almost said 50, like, I don't know, are we gonna have more states maybe? I mean, the way Trump's talking, we're gonna have Greenland and Panama and Canada. I don't know if Canada, if we, let's just say the craziness in Canada, got folded into the US, would it just be one state? It seems like, because they've got all, they've got, I don't know how many, like 10 provinces or 12 provinces. I don't know what they've got. Because you got Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba and Yukon. And anyway, that's a little bit of my background.
If you're a fan of dystopian fiction and sci-fi thrillers, then you should check out Lucid, a new novel by writer Michael S. Milano. Lucid is a 21st century blend of 1984 and Brave New World, set during a devastating pandemic. The year is 2084, and the Pansophical Corporation protects what's left of humanity from the deadly Timbaku virus and a terrorist organization known as Praxis. After losing his wife to the pandemic and being assaulted by public safety for violating curfew, citizen Anthony Sartori begins to have bizarre flashbacks. In a culture dominated by suspicion, asking the wrong questions could put him in the crosshairs, but Anthony is determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. Lucid is an exciting and timely read that cautions against collectivism, technological surveillance, and sacrificing freedom for the illusion of safety. If that's up your alley, go to lucidthebook.com and grab yourself a copy today. That's LUCID, thebook.com, to get yourself a copy. Free to be safe, safe to be free. lucidthebook.com. Man, there's so many good directions that we can go in from there. I'm curious to know, though, as someone who is now a major advocate for the carnivore diet, what was it like when you first discovered it? And how did you first discover it? You said you saw, was it an online thing? You saw people talking about it online, or how did you even come across it?
Crazy, nutty people that were, they called themselves, and there's a guy named Charles Washington. I think he's got a Philly or something like that. And he was running this group, and there was maybe, I don't know, 2,000-3,000 people in that particular group, and they were just talking about eating meat. And I was low carb, and so I was just kind of finding information. I ran into this group of people, and they were kind of outcasts from the low carb world because they were too extreme. They're like, yeah, it's, you guys are just too nutty. And I just got this morbid curiosity. I was like, this is weird. It's kind of like, it's like, you watch stuff that's weird to you. It's like social media. Like, that looks really weird. I'm gonna watch it for a while. And so, but they were, some of the stuff they were talking about kind of made some sense. And they started bringing up, some of the stuff. There's a guy named Stefansson who was this Icelandic guy. He was Icelandic of descent, but he lived in Canada. And he lived up with all the Inuit for like a dozen years. And he said, this is back in the early part of the 20th century, so like 1915. And he said, I lived like, for several years, and we only ate meat. And at the time, the people at Harvard and New York, all the big scientists said, you're full of it. That's BS. You could never survive. And so he said, you know what? I'll prove it. So he basically locked, he and another guy, this guy named Karsten Anderson, went into a hospital system, Bellevue Hospital in New York. And they said, for a year, you can follow us. And so they locked them in the hospital for about a month, and they watched them, everything they ate. And then they assigned somebody to follow them everywhere they went for a year. There was literally like a shadow. We're watching everything they ate, live with them. And after a year, they were like, yeah, we did it. We're fine. Nothing wrong. They tested them, and they're like, they're totally fine. So this is sort of the beginning of the beginning of this. And he basically said, this is the best I'd felt my whole life. This is back again, whatever it was, 1915, 1918. The study was in 1928. And they wrote like 6 papers on this stuff. And so this group was kind of talking about that stuff. And there was some other stuff. They're talking about athletes. There was an athlete, I can't remember, his name was, I think, Arthur Shrub, back around 1902 or something like that. He was a world record holder in like every running event, 100 meter, 10,000 meter, marathon. I mean, he was like the guy, 10,000 meter. He dominated everything. He was basically on this all meat diet, which is kind of interesting because you hear about, you must have carbohydrates to perform at the highest level. And that's being, certainly challenged in many ways. And I know that's a kind of an off topic. Like I said, my interest really is in the health side of it, but the athletic stuff is kind of interesting. I mean, like for instance, I just broke a world record last night, Concept 2. I don't know if you know the Concept 2 rowing machines. They compete. They have like about 50,000 people every year that compete. And so for my age group, 55 plus, at 100 meters, 13.6 seconds, the world. I had the world record already, so I just broke it again last night. But I just did it on steak. Um, but yeah, so this group was doing this, and like I said, I had this morbid curiosity, and then I said I tried it for like a day. I said, well, let me just eat steak and eggs for a day, and I was like, okay, I felt good. I enjoyed it. They taste good. I enjoy eating steak. And then it went from there, from 1 day to 2 days to a week to 2 weeks, and then finally 2016, I did it for 30 days. I was on Twitter. It was Twitter back then, and I had like 3,000 followers. And I said, hey, I'm going to do this crazy thing. I'm sure I'm going to die after 30 days. I'm either going to have a heart attack, or I'm going to die of scurvy, or my colon's going to seize up from lack of fiber. But surely I'm going to die. And of course, I didn't die, and I just felt good. I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And so that's how I got started. That has now turned into, gosh, hundreds of thousands, if not a few million people have now experimented with this stuff, and they've got all the various variations, animal-based stuff, which is all fine. I think the message here is that meat is not killing us. It's not, something we need to vilify or minimize. In fact, I think we should eat more of it, quite honestly. I'm happy to see more people are doing that, and just get rid of the garbage, because as you know, I mean, we just in the US, and I don't know what it's like in Dubai or UK or where, but you're seeing more and more sick, unhealthy, metabolically unhealthy people, and that's a real problem. I mean, when you go in a society and 1 out of every 4 people has a mental health disorder, which is what the current stats are in the US. How often do you have 2 people with mental health disorders running into each other? It's just like every time you have a crowd, there's a bunch of crazy people, and then things kind of devolve. And that's why we have all this crazy online rhetoric, I think, in many ways. And I think society would be a lot better if we would feed people properly and stop, literally poisoning them. And this is, I mean, I had a lady who worked for one of these big food companies as a food chemist, and she said, I want to come work for you guys. And she was like 60 and she was ready to retire. And she says, I feel so guilty about what I've done. And I said, what did you do? And she said, well, my job for the last 25 years was to literally make people addicted to these foods. And that's what's happened. And they absolutely did it with intent. As you probably know, the tobacco companies that kind of got broken up in the 1980s bought all the food companies and just employed the same tactics. This food is literally addictive. And um, we're paying the price of that, that experimentation, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think the answer is obvious from what the name is. But to be precise and to clarify for people listening, what exactly constitutes the carnivore diet? Does it literally mean only meat and absolutely nothing else? Is it certain types of meat? Are there any vegetables or other, are there eggs, that type of thing? When people talk about the carnivore diet, and I would assume there's probably a few versions of it, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so there are a few people that have different versions, but essentially it means animal products. So it would mean meat, any kind of meat. It could be beef, lamb, chicken, goat, octopus, seafood, shellfish, shrimp, eggs. Dairy products are there for some people. Some people tolerate it well, some people don't. Like I said, when you're dealing with someone with a severe autoimmune disease, you tend to restrict even more. And some of those people are just literally eating nothing but beef and water and salt, maybe. That would be the more strict version of that. Most people will, tolerate a little bit of seasoning, maybe in coffee and tea and things like that. Primarily drinking water. We cut out sugar, we cut out grains, we cut out fruits and vegetables, breads, pastas, processed foods, those types of things. And so many people will say that, and this is often the criticism I hear. It's like, well, if you just cut out the junk food, you'd be fine. You don't need to go that extreme. You don't need to cut out all the plants and the vegetables. And for most people, that's probably true. However, I, I'm very kind of conservative based in my thought about, what works medically and what doesn't. It takes a lot to convince me that something crazy like this is actually worth pursuing. And the only reason I'm actually an advocate, a proponent of this, is because I've seen overwhelming results over and over again, where people that were eating a otherwise clean diet, they were eating their fruits and vegetables, and they weren't eating junk food, and they weren't eating sugar, and they weren't eating processed foods. Those people still being sick, you remove the fruits and vegetables, and they get better. And it just is what it is. And I can't say that it shouldn't be, or it's something that doesn't make sense. It's just what happens. Now, why that's occurring, I'm sure it has to do with, gut physiology, gut, disruption pathology. And when it's interesting when we look at our actual, our anatomy and the physiology of our gut, we're well designed to process meat. I mean, that's just a reality. I know you hear these things, oh, meat just rots in your colon. That's just complete garbage. There's no evidence that would support that. And it's just a very gentle food on our gut, believe it or not, particularly when you don't overload fat and you do it that way. So what happens is, people just, the first thing they see is their gut improves, and then the downstream effects of that, the autoimmune disease, the inflammatory diseases, the mental health diseases, all seem to get better with this. And so, yeah, so there's no fiber. I know this is one of those things. Oh, how are you going to go to the bathroom? You go to the bathroom just fine. You just have less volume. When you think about, it's kind of a goofy topic, but when you think about when you go to the bathroom, it's bacteria, it's sloughed off cells, and it's undigested fiber. That's basically what your waste material is. But you just remove the undigested fiber from that, and you still are removing all these other things out of there. One of the biggest criticisms is about the risk of cholesterol and heart disease, and that's a whole can of worms topic that I'm happy to go into if you have an interest in that. But that's I mean, the biggest criticisms I see are, where's your fiber, where's your phytonutrients, what about cholesterol? And those things we certainly can talk about. Most people don't realize that beef is actually full of phytonutrients. When a cow consumes a much more diverse from a plant standpoint than we can tolerate. I mean, cows can eat things that we would die if we try to eat them. They eat grass. The silicate contents of grass would destroy our guts. Cows can chew all that up, and they incorporate those nutrients into their fat, into their tissues. And so we actually consume them secondhand. So they do kind of the hard work for us, and then we can just consume that. It's just a much more efficient way to eat.
Yeah. So, I mean, the place my brain immediately goes to is just questions around getting enough vitamins and minerals. I mean, if you were to look at the nutrition breakdown of a steak, you're not seeing, as far as I'm aware, I don't think you're seeing sort of tons of vitamin C and certain other things in there. So, how does it not result in certain deficiencies, especially when you're going as far as cutting out the fruit, cutting out the vegetable? Like, it sounds so counterintuitive, not just to like the way a normie who has no interest in nutrition or exercise would think, but even for those of us who are very much into health and fitness and training, the idea of, canceling out the fruit, canceling out the vegetables, just canceling out all of these nutrient dense foods, it sounds kind of crazy. So how does just eating meat, how do you make sure you get enough of that? Or am I just misunderstanding it?
No, I mean, certainly if you compare it against something called the RDA, the recommended daily allowances, and remember, those things were developed on a standard population eating a diet that is about 60% carbohydrates and full of grains. And we know that the metabolism and the physiology is just different when you're in a ketogenic diet, when you're on an animal-based diet. We have different processes that are being upregulated, and certain ones that are being downregulated. And so the requirements are a little bit different. And vitamin C is a very good one because, clearly they would say, well, you're not getting much vitamin C. Clearly you would develop something called scurvy. Now, scurvy used to kill a lot of people, and it's a very dramatic presentation. Your teeth start falling out, you bleed everywhere, your joints fill up with blood, your skin starts breaking down. I don't have any of that. I'm here breaking world records on a rowing machine. So I'm not having scurvy, and nor has anyone that I've seen, a legitimate evidence of that. And so just vitamin C alone is a good example because we can talk about what does vitamin C do in the body. Well, it's certainly involved in carbohydrate metabolism. It is involved in collagen formation. It's involved in carnitine production, which is very critical to metabolism. And what we find is that, number one, glucose and vitamin C on a structural level look very similar. And so they compete with each other going across membranes. So across the gut membrane, across the mitochondrial membranes. And so because they're so similar and they compete with each other, when glucose levels come down, vitamin C is more easily brought in. So again, that already shows you're gonna absorb more than you normally would. Also, vitamin C, as you know, is an antioxidant. And we also know that what happens is in a low carb state, our endogenous antioxidant system is upregulated. So we have more, say, for instance, glutathione floating around. So now we need less vitamin C. Vitamin C, as I mentioned, is also used in carnitine metabolism. Well, you're consuming directly carnitine in meat, and so your carnitine levels go up endogenously without the excess vitamin C required. And that's probably the biggest. That's probably the biggest one. We also know that vitamin C can be recycled somewhat, like the red blood cell can recycle vitamin C. So the short answer is our requirements for vitamin C are likely downregulated in this particular setting. We also are absorbing more of what we're getting. And meat does have some vitamin C. In fact, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when people were first starting to explore the North and the South Pole, they found out that if they had access to fresh meat, not dried meat like the British sailors, the so-called limeys used to have, but if they had access to fresh meat, it not only prevented scurvy, but it would also cure scurvy. So we know that there's differences in requirements. Like for instance, the RDA does actually make allowances for things like zinc. So if you put the RDA in for zinc, and then if you're eating let's say 1 gram of phytic acid. Now, you get phytic acid from grains and legumes and things like that. So if you're eating 1 gram of phytic acid a day, you need to double your zinc intake. And if you're eating 2, you have to triple your zinc intake. So the RDAs are kind of conditional in many ways. And we really haven't studied this particular population to the level that it should be. I see all kinds of lab abnormalities in absence of clinical symptoms or signs or any kind of pathology. And so we have to realize that just because we have this normative data based on a very different population, it doesn't always apply here. And so, like, for instance, folate might be low. For instance, cholesterol might be high. And there's reasons for that that make sense physiologically when you actually look at it. But since most people don't have the training on that, most doctors are just kind of reflex up, cholesterol's high, here goes your drug, or this number's low, you need a supplement. And that may not be the case. And so I think we have to start to kind of critically think a little more than just follow algorithms that are kind of laid down by medical organizations or even drug companies. It's interesting where medicine is going, where AI is going to take over a lot of medicine. And it's all going to be these drug company algorithms, and I don't know if you saw the House of Representatives proposed in the U.S. Legislation that would give AI prescribing power. So that would mean you would medically license an AI. That's a huge interesting development, and I look at that somewhat a little bit horrified. But from a cost standpoint, much cheaper because you don't have to pay these doctors 6 figures to prescribe your drugs. Just have an AI do it for free, basically. I mean, you train the AI, and it becomes much more economical. So people will get their drugs a lot more easily, a lot less hassle, expense. But what's the downside of that? Because we're already seeing a society where everybody, they want to put everybody on drugs, right? All that, like, even with the weight loss drugs, the Ozempic stuff, and we could certainly discuss that. But that's where we're going.
Man, I definitely want to talk more about the wider context of just the state of health and where some of these technologies could be taking us. But I want to drill in a little bit more on the carnivore diet because it's interesting because I actually know a few people who do it, and I've certainly followed for many years several people who are advocates of it. I've never tried it myself personally. I don't know how much room there necessarily is for me to benefit from it because I don't have any sort of metabolic health issues or wider health issues or anything like that. And, I'm in great shape and feel good. Um, but I've always been kind of curious about it just because of its counterintuitive nature. Are there any nutritional deficiencies that do typically occur with it or not at all?
Well, as far as like clinical manifestation, now you can see lab abnormalities. Like you might see someone who, like I said, folate is often low. You might see people with high vitamin B12 is, so outside of the ranges. So we do see things out of the ranges. Now, whether or not they actually result in overt clinical symptoms and signs and I can't say that I see that consistently. It's something that, um, you know, you could make speculations. There's people saying, well, you need to balance this out with bicarbonate because you're going to become too acidic. And again, that doesn't really show up, at least in the data we've had so far. Now, again, granted, there's not a ton of long-term research on this, and honestly, I don't know if it'll happen, because it costs money and there's nobody who wants to spend money on stuff like this. But There, to my knowledge, I have not seen anybody developing signs of overt deficiencies. Some people will see their thyroid levels go down. I think what's going on there is we become more thyroid sensitive, just like we become insulin sensitive. There's, this interaction between the hormone and the receptor itself. And if the receptor sensitivity goes up, you just need less hormone. And that's generally thought to be a good thing in the context of insulin, but it's really, I think it's a good thing in the context of most hormones. You'd rather need less and not require and have that organ constantly pumping out high levels of this hormone to maintain function if you're more resistant to it. So we don't really see, at least from the clinical side, deficiency states. Now, what I do see, and this is one of the problems that many people run into, because the diet is very satiating. We have this sense of I get full very easily, and I have this profound satiety, and I don't want to eat again for maybe, normally most people get hungry every couple hours and they're always snacking. In this situation, most people eat once a day, twice a day, and that's it. Some people tend to undereat. And then that's a whole different, sort of can of worms, because when you're undereating, you know, thyroid can shut down, you can lose your hair, you can just feel awful. And so you got to kind of prompt people, hey, you need to eat more. That's probably the biggest thing I see with regard to that type of situation where people don't feel good, is just they're under eating most times.
I got it. Who do you recommend the diet for? Because you've already said that it's certainly not for everybody, but who do you think it's particularly beneficial for?
For you, like for you, you're metabolically healthy, you're fit, you're lean, work out, and you don't have any issues. Don't need to do it. I see no benefit for you. I mean, you do it for an experiment or that type of thing. But some people, like when I did it, I wasn't particularly that unhealthy. I mean, I was 50 and I had some aches and pains, but I wasn't like, oh, I got all these diseases. But I did it and I felt better, which was cool. I thought that was kind of neat. So I think people that just don't feel well, or certainly I think the best case scenarios for this are things like autoimmune conditions, particularly like the gut ones, like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease. I think that should be the frontline therapy for this. I think this is where people should start, because it would avoid, gosh, years of pain and suffering and drugs and surgeries. I think people with, basically recalcitrant diseases. I mean, we see people with certainly mental health disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, even things like PTSD improve on this. I've seen people with uh, ADHD, autism improves the symptom, doesn't cure it, but it improves the symptoms certainly. Tourette syndrome, which is kind of a bizarre. I remember the first time I saw somebody with Tourette syndrome get better, I was kind of blown away by that. You can use it for things like metabolic disease, diabetes, but you don't need it. I mean, you can do any kind of low carb diet will often help things like diabetes. But it's kind of a more powerful version. It's just one of those things where if you've tried other things, and most people that come to this diet, have tried all these other things. They've tried the Weight Watchers, they've tried the juice fast, they've tried the balanced diets, the calorie counting, and it's failed for them. And so those people, it's kind of the end of the road thing for a lot of people. I think people with food addiction, and I believe that's a real condition. I think there are people that truly are addicted to these foods that are designed to be addictive, right? I think that clearly exists. And for those people, it's like alcoholism. You don't tell an alcoholic, hey, just have a margarita on the weekend, you'll be fine. That doesn't work. So those people, those things. So I think people with food addiction, I think people with autoimmune diseases are probably, or some of these mental health disorders, are probably the top priority people for this. And then, beyond that, it's kind of like, you can do it for fun.
Got it. I mean, how does it work? What's the mechanism scientifically behind this? Because it's such a strange concept. So obviously, I mean, because you're talking about everything from autoimmune disorders improving to various mental health issues and conditions improving. Obviously, things like obesity, diabetes, it can help with that. But what is the mechanism that's going on there?
So, I mean, some of this is going to be theoretical, but I mean, there's a lot of things that we know that are happening. And so we have to say, are these what's causing? So I think that many people will say all disease starts in the gut. And I think there's some truth to that. If you think about our contact with the environment. So, you think about how is our body being contacted by the environment? And we think about our skin. The skin is the largest organ, so on and so forth. But the surface area of the average human of skin is about 1.73 square meters. That's an average size human. And skin is designed to repel. We're waterproof. We don't have a lot of things that get past our skin barrier. There's some things that can get through, but not a lot. Our gut, on the other hand, has a much larger surface area. Our gut, actually, from our mouth through all of our stomach, intestines, that's all external to our body, believe it or not, even though it's inside our body, but it's actually external the way we're designed.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean it's external?
So our mouth is not considered inside of our body. Our esophagus is not considered inside of our body. That inside of that tube is actually outside of our body. So it's actually external to our environment.
I don't get that. I'm trying to understand that.
So if you were to take, so it's like a donut, right? So it's like a long, elongated donut. The whole of the donut is not part of the donut. It's external to the donut. And so that tube, 'cause like you said, if you open your mouth, that is still that's external air. I mean, it's not inside of our organs. There's a barrier. And our gut has this surface area of about the size of a tennis court, right? We've got all these villi and microvilli that, interact with the environment. And 70% of our immune system resides within our gut for that very reason, because we're bringing in stuff. And our gut is designed to absorb, right? If it didn't, we would all starve to death because it's designed to bring in particles, whereas our skin's designed to repel. Our gut is designed to absorb things from the outside, right? So the hamburger is outside my body, right? And then I put it in my mouth, and it doesn't get inside my body until it crosses that membrane from the inside of our gut into the blood vessels, right? So it's still external. And so when that barrier is compromised, we have, some people call it leaky gut or gut hyperpermeability. That starts to set downstream effects. So we get all these foreign particles that aren't supposed to get through. So we get these bacterial products, we get these, things we absorb through the environment that aren't supposed to, and they start getting through, and that starts to see this downstream effect. We get this molecular mimicry where foreign particles get attached to our own system, our own cells and our own proteins, and they become identified as foreign, and our immune system starts to attack. This is the theory of autoimmune disease. There's a um, great bit of research out of Boston Children's Hospital by a guy named Alessio Faisano, who's looked at the relationship between gut hyperpermeability and autoimmune disease. And he's got a compelling argument to show that that's probably the origin of that particular condition. And that's why you often see somebody will have an autoimmune disease, they'll have one, but they'll often end up with 2 or 3 different diseases. It runs very commonly. And it's because of the same, common etiology. Gut breakdown leads to downstream effects. And that has impacts on inflammation in the body. We know there's clear relationships between gut pathology and joint pathology. We know there's clear relationships between gut pathology and skin pathology, psoriasis, eczema, things like that. Same thing with the mental health. And so I think that's sort of the maybe the proximate cause for some of this stuff. And then you have the downstream effects where it eventually affects the end organs. And so by improving the gut health, and I think meat does that, believe it or not. I know a lot of people say, oh, meat is inflammatory. It's actually not. And in fact, when we look at, like, for instance, inflammatory markers on people on a carnivore diet, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months in, flatline, they're down to nothing. And so we see what we see first is the gut feels better, then the inflammatory markers go down, and then the symptoms start to go away. So that's part of it. The other thing is, I think this nutrition is better. I mean, part of it, some of the issues we have are just nutritional deficiencies that we get. And if you think about, this is a simplistic way to think about it, but I think it holds up pretty well. So if I were to say, I've got to build this house out of, like, this fake wall behind me out of bricks, it would be really nice if I had a lot of bricks, right? If I had a lot of bricks, I could make a brick house easier. Now, if I only got straw and mud, I could still do it, but it's going to take a lot more work and effort. And so I'm made up of animal cells, as are you and every other human on the planet. We're all made up of all these animal cells. And the animal cells are like little bricks. And we're like, where do I get more brick material? Well, I can get it from more animal cells. So when I'm eating a steak, I'm getting all these little animal cells and all the animal cell components. Now, if I eat broccoli, broccoli's not bricks. Broccoli's made out of cellulose and all these other things that aren't really well designed. So it's kind of like the straw and mud analogy. And so it's more efficient. And in fact, if we look at, like, nutrition strategies for all species of animals that have ever lived on planet Earth, everything that's flown or swam or crawled on the ground, about 75% of them have been carnivorous because it's a simpler way to get nutrition. Now, if you're an herbivore, like a cow or a deer, much more complicated anatomy. And so it's much more work. It's much more specialized to do that. Now, humans have some specialization. Now, we are omnivorous. I mean, clearly humans are omnivorous creatures. However, when we do like comparative anatomy, like comparing a human to another primate, like a chimpanzee or a gorilla, our gut is very much different in what's been emphasized. Like a gorilla or a chimpanzee, like something like 50 to 70% of their calories can come from fiber digestion. So this is why a gorilla, for instance, like I weigh right now, I'm like, I think it was 255 when I woke up this morning. I'm not too small, too much different than like a silverback gorilla is like 300. I eat about 3 or 4 pounds of food a day. A gorilla is going to eat 50 to 60 pounds because it's so inefficient. They're having to constantly eat and forage all day long, and then they have to eat their own feces to get vitamin B12, which is kind of goofy to think about. We don't have to do that now. So I think that from what's going on here. I mean, even like obese people, you think about them, but they're actually malnourished. You think about it, obesity is a sufficiency of calories, but an insufficiency of critical nutrients. And that's why a lot of them are constantly trying to eat because we're just kind of feeding ourselves this food that is not really food. I mean, it's calories, it's looks like food, it tastes delicious. I mean, they make these really delicious foods, but they're not providing us the things we need, whether it's critical amino acids, whether it's certain vitamins and minerals. So we continue to eat until we get there. And if we're just eating stuff that doesn't have any nutrition, we're going to eat and eat and eat and eat. And that's how this stuff has been designed. So as far as for instance, I'll like, and there's all kinds of examples, like depression. There was a nice study out of Stanford in 2018 that looked at major depressive disorder. And one thing they discovered was people with major depressive disorder often have low carnitine levels, right? Now, we make carnitine endogenously. Like I mentioned this earlier with carnitine and vitamin C, but the level is kind of relatively low. And depressed people, it's even lower. Where do you get carnitine from? Well, you can supplement it, but you can get it from meat. Meat is the place where you're going to get carnitine. And so a lot of people, and I see this all the time. In fact, this is one of the more common things I see with people going carnivore. They will be, maybe they're depressed, maybe they have anxiety. And in fact, there was a case series that was just published in 2024. Yeah, 2024, I think came out, showing that people with anxiety and depression, if they're put on, they call it an animal-based ketogenic diet. So it's a low carb, high fat, animal-based diet, basically a carnivore diet. By 7 weeks, almost all the patients' anxiety went away. By 12 weeks, all their depression went away. And this in part probably has to do with brain metabolism, with ketosis, but also probably with carnitine. I think those things are going in there. So there's probably multiple things that mechanisms by which we can propose why these things are getting better. Now, of course, what we'll see is, once this gets studied, drug companies will try to say, well, what's the thing we can do to sell the drugs? And I think it's more comprehensive. In my view, as a surgeon, as a physician, this has been probably one of the most sort of across the board effective interventions, medical interventions you can do. I mean, it's crazy to say that, because you got all these medicines and all these technologies. And certainly if I break my femur and my bone's sticking out, don't feed me a steak, take me to the hospital and let somebody throw a plate on there. But as far as, the things that it improves, and it just makes sense. There's people, I remember 5 years ago, we were talking about people getting better mental health when they change their diet. And they said, well, that's BS. You got to deal with their trauma. You got to do this cognitive-based behavioral therapy and put them on lithium and SSRIs and all that stuff. And there's no way food could do all that. But the reality is, our brain is an organ just like any other, heart, lungs, kidneys, liver, skin. It's impacted by the nutrition. And so it's pretty amazing to see when you get people that are literally at wit's end, they're suicidal, and you change their diet, and all of a sudden they get back into life. They're like, they get a job, they have a kid, they start, living like they're supposed to. And we have so many people that are suffering in that way. And we ignore the fact that nutrition is due because there's no money in it. It's just like I said, it's like, I'm trying to get research studies done. I'm working with like various state legislatures to try to get some research done on this stuff. And it's like pulling teeth, man. But if you got a drug that does this, they'll pour millions and millions of dollars in, at the drop of a hat. You see these Ozempic drugs, these GLP-1s, and they're saying, well, you see these physicians saying, anecdotally, we're seeing decreases in cardiovascular events. And so they'll pour all this money into that. if they get any whiff of that it might improve this particular disease process, they'll pour all this money so they'll get another indication so they can make their hundreds of billions of dollars on this. But the same things are happening with nutrition. In fact, more so. But we just don't have the money to study it, unfortunately.
What are your thoughts on Ozempic and similar drugs?
So I think there are some use case scenarios where it makes sense. I think I think it's clearly being overprescribed. I think it's going to harm a lot of people. I think that it's probably being utilized in sort of an indiscriminate fashion, which I think there's going to be, I mean, certain percentage of people are going to lose weight. The problem is, again, it's a disease maintenance issue that you have to be on this drug the rest of your life, which, at $1,000 is an injection or a month or whatever they're charging for it. Um, you know, Here's the deal with Ozempic. It's a GLP-1 receptor agonist. So basically GLP-1 is what's called an incretin hormone. So the way it works normally in humans is, we eat food, nutrition kind of winds its way through our intestine. As it gets to the end of the intestine in the area called the ileum, there are cells, these so-called L cells, that will sense nutrition. And when they see there's too much protein or too much fat getting down there, it'll send out this GLP-1, which will say, slow things down. The gut needs to slow down so we have more time to absorb the stuff. That's the normal way it happens. And that hormone will last 5 minutes or so, and then it'll kind of go away. These drugs, you get a massive dose of that, and it just stops everything. It says, gut, slow down. And then we get this sense of satiety and fullness, and we just don't want to eat. A lot of people get nauseous. A lot of people vomit. We see the side effects where they get the so-called gastroparesis, where their gut is paralyzed. Sometimes that's relatively permanent. But the other thing is it decouples some of the metabolism in the fat cell. And so what happens is you get this fat cell hyperplasia. And maybe you're familiar with that term with muscle building. There's hypertrophy where things get bigger, and hyperplasia where more things are created. So what happens is, instead of fat cells getting bigger and bigger, which is pathologic, it's problematic, it's related with insulin resistance, the fat cells don't get bigger. They what they do is they grow. There's more of them. You get more little fat cells, but because there's so little, it takes up less room. So you actually lose weight. The problem with that is when you go off the drug, now you have a lot more fat cells than you started with. And so, if you go off the drug and you for whatever reason, you can't afford it, or you have too many side effects, now you're going to have this situation where now you have more fat cells than you used to. And that has a potential, because those fat cells get bigger and bigger over time because your appetite comes back, and sometimes with a vengeance. The other thing is, obviously, there's a high percentage of muscle loss that occurs in lean mass and bone loss. And so we're starting to see, particularly women, developing osteoporosis. And it's because, they go to the Quack Shack, or the pill, the pill website, and, they get put on the drug. They don't exercise, they don't strength train, they don't eat enough protein. And so they just lose all this lean mass. And so, it's, in the short term, they lose those 20 pounds, but they've lost muscle mass and bone mineral density. And so what happens is when they go off the drug, now they're starting in a place where they're going to gain all the fat back. But as you know, it's hard to put that muscle back on. You got to get in the gym and work hard. And so you may end up with people that are in worse condition. Now, if somebody is like super morbid obese, this is the same scenario where we talk about gastric bypass procedures. Maybe the net benefit for those guys is that, they can actually get healthier, because clearly living at 400 pounds is a big threat to your health. I mean, you're going to die early, most likely. I mean, this healthy at any size, as you probably know, is a bunch of BS. I mean, if you're morbidly obese, you're sick. I don't care. Maybe you haven't shown it yet, but you're definitely not healthy. And so for those folks, it probably makes sense. For the person that wants to lose 20, 30 pounds, it makes no sense at all to me. It really doesn't. I mean, I think it's a shame. And that's honestly where most of this use case scenario is going to be. That's where because most people go online, they say, I'm 20 pounds overweight. It's like all this stuff, like the erectile dysfunction drugs. You just go online and say, I need this, and they send it to you in the mail. And it's there's going to be a lot of people harmed from this, unfortunately. And the problem is, it won't get pulled. This is something that I didn't realize. So there's a lot of severe side effects. Like, I talk to ER physicians, and they say every day they get people coming into the ER on these drugs. Chronic, they're having obstructive, bowel issues. They're vomiting. They're having this horrible nausea. it's happening every day. And I said, "Well, how much is that's getting reported back to the FDA?" And they're like, "Well, we don't, no, not much, none of it." And we have this reporting system in the US, it's called MedWatch, right? It's supposed to be when a drug is brought to market, they do this limited testing. You know, the FDA says, "Well, you've done us testing, we'll bring it on the market." But you're supposed to do this post-market surveillance. That once it gets on the market, you're supposed to surveil that stuff. But apparently, less than 1% of complications actually get reported. So by the time you get enough reports to actually pull something from the market, probably a hundredfold has already occurred. So if we hear about one death, there's probably 100 that never got reported. It may not be death, but it might be like ER. I went to the ER because I couldn't stop vomiting or I had gastroparesis. Those things, only about 1% of those get reported. So it's one of those things where I think that, there'll be a lot of class action lawsuits against it. They're already forming. If it'll ever get pulled, I don't know. I mean, what'll happen is Novo Nordisk or Eli Lilly will pay, maybe they'll pay $1 billion fine, slap on the wrist, and they'll, of the 100 billion they made, 1%, and it's calculated into the cost of the drug anyway. So, I think it's far better to fix lifestyle, but the problem is it's really tough. It's tough to do that, particularly in the context of the modern medical system. When I was working as an orthopedic surgeon, I'd be seeing 50 patients a day. So you get, like, 5, 6 minutes with a patient. How much lifestyle are you going to do in 5 to 6 minutes? Almost none, because you're spending your time coding and billing and typing and try to talk to the patient and look at their X-ray and read their labs. There's no time for a discussion about, hey, you need to eat this way and exercise. And so that's a real problem. It's not incentivized. I can tell you, when I started talking about to my hospital administration back in 2012 or something like that, I said, "Hey guys, I'd like to spend maybe half a day a week counseling people on lifestyle." Guess what they said? "Hell no, we don't want you doing that because you're losing money. We're paying you to cut people, right?" That's basically what they told me in a nice, polite way. Basically, we don't have an appetite for that. We don't know if we can support that. Basically, they're saying, "Shut up and cut people." Right? And I was like, I don't think that's cool. I don't want to do that. So now, like, this is where our company Revero comes in. We said, look, we're going to take the time with our patients. We're going to provide them support and daily feedback so that they can actually, do the lifestyle stuff. Because it's not, some people you're going to say, "Hey, go read this book," and they'll do it. Most people, they need hand holding, they need motivation, they need encouragement, they need, you know, uh, cajoling, they need questions answered, they need feedback constantly. And that's what I found. And that's what something you're just not incentivized to do that through the standard healthcare system. And so in order to get people to actually make those changes, you got to put a lot of effort in. And it's easier just to write a prescription. Here, go take Ozempic. That's the easy way out, but it's not ultimately helping them, in my view.
Where do you think this is going to go over the next few decades? We can limit it to just the USA because that's the country you know best, but where do you see the state of American public health 10 years from now or even 20 years from now? Do you think it's going to keep going on the trend it has been over the last few decades with just worsening metabolic health, increasing obesity, and so on? What do you think is what is going to happen? Is life expectancy going to drop? Is it going to rise? Is the obesity thing going to start to reverse? What direction do you think it's going to go?
Well, I think, I don't know how much worse we can get. Right now we're 72% overweight and obese in this country. So, I mean, there's not many people left that can get, I mean, there's some studies that suggest 88% of us are metabolically unhealthy. And it's kind of funny. There's this, I don't know if you've seen the memes. It's like 12% of the people are eating all the meat and 88% of people are metabolically unhealthy. And I said, well, it's funny how that math works out. But I think that, obviously there's going to be push for more technology. I mean, that's just the way. I mean, people invest in technology, they invest in new drugs. Those things are not going away anytime. And some of those drugs will actually be helpful in the sense of changing some of that trajectory. I think you'll see that there will be people that will be better than they were, but ultimately they're not going to achieve the health that they probably want. All right. So you see the people with the Ozempic face, a sucked in face, and they've lost all the lean tissue around their bodies. So we're going to see some of that. I think it'll be a trade-off. There'll be some other chronic disease that develops in its place, maybe more autoimmune disease. I don't know. We've got this so-called "Make America Healthy Again" movement that's occurring, and I don't know if RFK is going to be. I mean, I think Thursday he's scheduled to be voted on. So we'll see if he gets in and how much impact that will have. I do think that we will see AI take over a lot of medicine. I do think that eventually you'll have AI that's allowed to prescribe, and I think that will be more of a path to get more people more drugs more quickly and more cheaply. And so that route will occur, and it will because we spend $5 trillion a year in the U.S. on healthcare, and we don't get anything for it. I mean, it's bloated. The life expectancy is going down. Chronic disease rates have gone up. I don't know that chronic disease rates will go down significantly in that current model. But what you see is you'll have more people medicated, more symptomatic management occurring. And so maybe people feel a little less worse, but the disease itself won't go away. And in fact, we'll probably see, unless we fix the food supply, which may or may not happen. We'll see what these Make America Healthy people are able to do. I mean, getting red dye out of Fruit Loops, yeah, that's cool. That's cool. That's great. That's not obviously the big win you want. You want to, if we could stop having people eat human pet food, that's what I think. I think, like for instance, I think the food, um, ultra processed food, the junk food, is basically a drug. I mean, it's like a recreational drug, and people use it that way. You go in there and you just get a hit of this whatever, this tasty ultra processed food, and it gives you that drug like effect. And if people realize that and treat it that way, I think you'll have a different situation. I do think companies like what we're doing at Revero and other companies are going to start to flourish a little more. There's going to be this alternative pathway, and I think there's always people that want the sort of the drug and the pill and the easy way out. And there's other people that are like, look, I want a more holistic, comprehensive approach. I think there's going to be some level of competition between the two paradigms. My hope is that obviously the less drug paradigm flourishes more so, and I think that's going to happen once other big entities, like other big corporations, realize that it makes more sense to have healthy employees. Because you look at the average big company and they're spending enormous amounts of money on healthcare. I mean, that's just the way it is, particularly if they're self-insured. And that's one of the things our company will be engaging with enterprise markets to say, hey, look, we can cut your healthcare costs maybe by 50%. And so you have these big companies, because what will happen is right now medicine is becoming so corporatized, like Kaiser Permanente and Intermountain Health have taken over all these independent practices, and they're just swallowing up in this giant, global corporate capture. And so now there's no independent thought. It's like it's either my way or the highway. And it'll be, guess what? You're going to be mandated to have an AI run your practice. You might be able to oversee some of that, and you're going to be mandated to follow these algorithms. And these algorithms are all going to be written by the drug companies, as it is now. I mean, all these patient advocacy groups, American Diabetes Association, American Heart Association, the American Ataxia Foundation, they are all basically run by these drug companies. They're basically just means to facilitate more drug utilization. And so, that if that is allowed to continue, it'll just continue to do that because it's profitable. It's money making. At the end of the day, it's all about making money. So there's going to be some of that. Now, again, I think enough people, because people get some say in this, and we can drive the markets in some regard. If people stop buying garbage food, then they'll be forced to make, hopefully healthy food. This is the way things work. So we do get a vote in this. I know we talk about elections and votes, but you get a chance to vote every single day with what you purchase and who you support financially. And so if enough people say, look, I'm sick of my kids being sick and depressed and not knowing if they're a boy or a girl because they're mentally ill, and I know that's a controversial topic, but I mean,
Not in
I
my
think that
audience.
impacts that. Yeah, no, I know, but I mean, in the general world, but I mean, it's like, if enough people say, look, we're just not going to support that anymore. And I
Mm.
think that's happening. I think that's happening in a way, but there's definitely this unending desire to make profit, and the
Do
market,
you? I have a question, Shawn. I mean, this is a really interesting topic because when it comes to most things, I'm very much a fan of the free market and capitalism. But as I observe this and just seeing how it's trended over the last several decades and looking at the American model versus even how some other countries do things. For example, I'm from the UK, and I think even a lot of Americans know that in Europe, there are a lot of food ingredients that are very common in the US, which are actually outright banned in many European countries, for example. Some of the food dyes, some of the additives, things like that. And I sometimes wonder, is this like, and we could also, you also talked about how things were when you were working in the surgery and the push to get you to just, shut up and cut kind of thing. And I often wonder when it comes to the world of health, um, medical health care, big pharma, the food industry, is this an area where we're suffering from the excesses of capitalism in a way? Because on one hand, even amongst conservatives, for example, right now, I see a lot of people who are, they're very pro freedom, very pro individual responsibility, very pro people being able to make their choices and have autonomy and people being able to make money. But then out the other side of their mouth, they want kind of more regulations or certain things to be banned and so on. And I get both sides of it. And I just wonder if when it comes to this particular area, perhaps this is something where, certainly just kind of having a free market capitalism and all these big corporations just trying to make money off of what ultimately is not good for people's health. What's the best way to sort of manage that? I'm just thinking out loud here. I don't really know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I think that, I'm not, like we can look at like what do we do with cigarettes in the US? We didn't ban cigarettes, but we
Mhm.
taxed them, we educated, we put warnings on the labels. In the United States, 45% of the population was smoking in 1954. That's when we peaked. That number is now around 13%. So we've dramatically reduced that without banning it. Now, of course, people will say, well,
But you
if
just
you're
you
going to
just
tax
shifted
that,
them
what
to
else are you
food.
going to tax? Right, right. Well, you shifted into food in many ways, and some people would make that argument. But
Yeah.
I think it really comes down to informed consent, and I think this is what we saw during COVID. I mean, we threw informed consent out the window. As a surgeon, when I brought somebody to the operating room, I was required by law and ethically to tell them, "Hey, this is what I'm doing to you. These are all the options you have, and these are the things that could or could not happen." Right? With COVID, we kind of threw that out the window. We didn't. We kind of that's clear, and I know that's a long-winded discussion here. And I got my social media shut down multiple times talking about some of this nonsense that happened. But I think we don't have true informed consent around some of the stuff that's going on medically and with the food. And I think if people were to like really understand that, like for instance, this so-called GRAS is generally recognized as safe food additive thing that happens with the FDA.
I don't know what that
We
is.
get this. So when a new ingredient goes on the market, and like it's never been tested on humans before, they have to say, well, is it safe for humans? How do we test that? Like for instance, this Impossible Burger had this new product called soy leg hemoglobin. It was what made the burger kind of look like it was bleeding. Right. This is a new product that's never been tested in humans. What they did was they fed it to a couple rats and they saw some changes. And some of the rats got sick, but they said, well, we think it's generally okay for humans. And there was no like extensive testing. It was just like, okay, we generally think it's not going to kill people right away. Therefore, we can eat it. That's what's, I mean, I'm not kidding. It's that bad. There are thousands of ingredients over the last several decades that have been put on the market that way. And yes, it doesn't kill people right away, but does it cause them to have autoimmune disease? Does it cause them to have dementia? Does it cause them to have diabetes? We don't know. We just don't know that stuff. And so if we say these foods have not been extensively tested for the effects that they have on humans long term, then we can say, do I want to be eating that stuff? Like there's something like carrageenan, which is in all these food products. It's a thickening agent, right? It's in dairy products, and you go to get heavy cream, and it's like, what the hell? Why do they put that in? Why can't it just be cream? Why does it got to be cream plus gums and polysorbate 80 and mono and diglycerides? Well, what do those do to people? Well, in some cases, they indicate maybe it causes cancer, maybe it causes gut issues. So I think if people are informed better about what's actually in their food and why the hell is it in there? Well, it's in there for shelf life and palatability, and it sells more product. But is it actually making me sick? So I think we have to educate the people a little bit better about some of this stuff and to a point. And so you can have this, you can make that decision.
Yeah, here's a question, just jumping off of that thought right there, is a lot of people would make the argument that some of these foods and the ingredients in them, I think you hinted at this earlier, are and have been proven to be essentially as addictive as certain drugs. So, if that is the case and that can be proven, would there not perhaps be a case that informed consent is not really good enough per se? Because if something is actually physiologically addictive, then even if you tell, I mean, we know this, like we're both big on exercise and nutrition, and we both already know that, like, let's be real, most people have some vague idea of which foods are healthier than others, right? There's no one who really thinks like, I don't know, a bag of potato chips is healthier than some lean chicken breast or some broccoli or whatever it is. But despite people already having a lot of this information, they still continuously make poor choices. People make bad decisions. I mean, we all do it on occasion, but I just sometimes I kind of I want to believe that education is enough and informed consent is enough, but I just see how people actually behave in the real world outside of us. You know, we're weird, right? We're like hyper disciplined, all into bodybuilding, lifting weights, like, you know, eating right, all of that. But let's be real, we're like a tiny fraction of the population. But most people, they just don't do that. Like I know so many people who have decent nutritional knowledge, but they still just eat garbage, right? They still just eat whatever tastes good and whatever is convenient. They know it's not good for them, but you know, it's kind of like meh, whatever.
One thing that's interesting is you figure out, like, your adult patterns, right? It's where do you get your decision to eat? And most often it happens during adolescence and childhood. So, what you're taught from your parent, and this is where parenting comes into place, and I think part of it has to be the responsibility of raising good, healthy kids. And so, and it's not just what you tell your kids, what you do. You got to demonstrate for your kids. You know, if you say, "Hey, don't eat this junk food," and you're sitting there eating junk food and watching TV and watching your phone all day, your kids are going to emulate that. So that's part of it. And I think, you know, as you mentioned, all these foods are very addictive, and this is one of the problems. I see physicians saying, "Well, diet and exercise don't work because we tried that before. We tried it in the '80s and it didn't work, and therefore everybody gets shots." Right? And I say, "What did you try?" "Well, we tried the low fat, eat a bunch of salad, salad and chicken breast." And the problem with that is people get hungry when you do that. You don't feed them energy. That's why, again, we're having so much success with these kind of carnivore style diets, is because you're finally nourishing people to a point. And I think we have to start to stop fearing fat, saturated fat. I mean, that's going to be part of it. I know the dietary guidelines panel. That's a real problem when we have a U.S. dietary guidelines panel where 95% of the people on that panel have conflicts of interest from processed food industries. That's a real problem. So we have to clean that stuff up. So it's hopefully something like that RFK can say, look, no more conflict of interest. The fact that we have the USDA even giving our dietary guidelines. What does USDA do? What is one of their jobs? To sell commodity crops, corn, wheat, sugar, grain, soybeans. And they're also in charge of telling us what we're supposed to eat, even though they're supposed to be selling all this stuff. So we have this really skewed way to do that. So I think in many ways it has to start in childhood. You have to start feeding these kids healthy foods. If you're a parent, your kid's not going to love you anymore because you fed them a bunch of junk food, even though it tastes good, and they get diabetes or they get depression, and now they want to chop off their penis or something like that. That's not love to your child. So part of it has to be um, individual responsibility. You've got to take responsibility for yourself and the health of your family. So that message has got to get out there. More people have to act upon that. And there's only so much the government can do. I mean, like I said, we can either say, we're going to ban foods, which I don't think is going to go over well in the US or probably most places, quite frankly. Or we can say, look, this is what's in the food. Yeah, yes, educating, but I mean, at the same time, you have to give somebody some physiologic tools. Like I said, I can know that, you know, Krispy Kreme donuts are bad for me, but if I'm friggin' hungry, I'm going to eat the damn things. And I remember, as a surgeon, I do that. I would walk by the break room between my surgical cases. Somebody have a bunch of donuts, and they're like, I'm not going to eat that stuff. But by the time the second or third case rolled by, and I'm starting to get a little hungrier and hungrier, go in there and snag one of those donuts, and that one donut turned into half the damn box because I'm, I'm a big guy and I like to eat. So, but if I have on board, if I would have went to the cafeteria in the morning and loaded up on steak and eggs or something like that, something healthy, enough fat, enough stuff to stick to your ribs, so to speak, I'm not going to fall prey to the donut. So I think we have to start learning how to feed ourselves, learning how to feed our kids, and then we have more of this physiologic reserve so we can resist this stuff. It's not, there's not one easy solution there.
I think that's the thing that's really difficult because I think on an individual level and on a theoretical and even practical level, the answers are clear. And I think sure, nutritional science is always developing, but the answers have been pretty clear for a pretty long time in terms of what is broadly healthy and what is not. I think when you get to the scale of the public, if you're talking the USA, a country of 350 million people, I think it's probably closer to 400 million, but that's another topic, where you already have over 70% of adults obese or overweight. Again, you're talking about parents teaching their children, but most parents are not healthy. So, what are they teaching and modeling to their children? Um, I don't know. I sometimes wonder if I don't know if it's a solvable problem. And there aren't very many things where I say that. I just think at scale, on an individual level, on a small group level, perhaps on a community level, I think it's really clear, but I just don't know how you scale it to a large nation.
Let's look at our COVID response, right?
Okay.
How many people in the US didn't know about standing 6 feet apart?
Didn't
Do you
know?
think anybody did not know that you were
Yeah.
supposed to stand 6 feet apart?
The Amish?
I mean, everywhere you went, you were inundated with this message. Radio shows, TV commercials, late night talk shows, everywhere there was a sign. Every store you went into had these markers, right? We as a nation decided this is our priority.
Mhm.
And my frustration was, why the hell aren't we telling people we're spending $1 trillion on this COVID message? Why the hell aren't we telling people stop eating junk food? I
Incentives.
mean, that could happen if we really, really, really wanted to solve this problem. We would message it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just like we did during that COVID. And we could say, look, this food is killing you. You need to stop eating it.
Mhm.
Mandate signs everywhere. Say, look, this crap is killing you. I mean, we could do it if we wanted to. I
But
think it is a solvolable
yeah. Okay.
education standpoint.
So this is really interesting for me. So I mean, the question to me is, because to me things always boil down to incentives, especially when you're at that scale. So given all the corruption that already exists and all the connections and lobbying and all of these things that exist in big pharma, that exist in big food, like there's just so many layers of it. So what would be the incentive to do that? I know I think I think you and I both have a good idea of what the incentives were behind the pandemic response because you saw who made the billions of dollars from it,
Right.
benefited. But in this one, it would be disincentivized, right? Because there's so much money to be made from pushing the drugs and from pushing the garbage food. And there's so much money to be lost by telling people, hey, actually, um, this stuff can be fixed by a combination of, let's say, fasting and eating more meat and cutting out all of this crap from your diet, right? There's not much money or power to be gained there. So if we're talking at the governmental or state level, I understand it in theory and I totally agree in theory, but I'm just like, what would be the incentive to do that? And how would you
Well,
get out that web of all that muck and corruption that already exists that is blocking it? Um, can that be cleared up?
I mean, yeah, I mean that's you look at what Trump and Musk are doing right now, right? They're in there going through the government saying we're paying billions of dollars to people that are criminals. So I mean, you'd have to have something similar to that. It's saying, look, we are going to because and if you look at how many people support that, I would say a plurality of Americans, probably more than 50%, are saying yes, get all the corruption out there. I don't want to pay taxes to, fund, lesbian comic books in Guatemala or whatever it might be. I mean, we're seeing that right now. So I think if those same people say, hey, look, I'm tired of big pharma and their predatory practices in these food companies preying upon me and making me and my kids sick, then you have that in the same thing that's driving that could potentially drive this sort of sentiment there. Now, again, if Kennedy gets in there and he says, "Hey, look, we are going to get the conflict of interest out there. We're tired of people profiteering on sick people," and that should be. I mean, I think most people, if you would say, and you put a ballot initiative there and said, "Do you think people should make money by preying upon sick people?" I think 99% of the population would say no. There's some people would say, yeah, I like because I'm making the money on it, right? But most people would say they would support that. I think so. So I think it's a matter of the public standing up and saying, "Look, we want this to happen." And, obviously you're dealing with emotional stuff, you're dealing with food addiction, you're dealing with people that this is how they soothe their trauma. Your grandmother gave you chocolate chip cookies when you were a good kid, and you've got all this stuff you're fighting against. But I do think, um, I do think there is a way to incentivize this in the fact that the problem is, can you make money? Because again, as you know, it's like I said, the pandemic. Who's packeting billions of dollars on this COVID thing? Somebody made a lot of money off it. I guarantee it. And those actors will, maybe they'll be revealed or not. I don't know. But I think you do have to figure out how to make it profitable. How can healthy people be profitable? And I think it's like, well, what about productivity and all these other aspects of society where we can make money, because I mean, it's, there's more resources that we can utilize in this world so that we can raise the standard of living and raise the overall, quality of life for a lot of people. And I think that's where, on the incentive side, and I think there is some money in that. I think there is, productivity can produce wealth, and I think that's where you get it, because right now most people are operating at 40% capacity because they're sick, they're tired, they're obese, they can't do anything, they can't concentrate. And so when you do that, you can unleash a lot of power in that regard. So I think the long game, you can make the argument that there's some incentive to do so.
That makes sense. Are there any countries that you see that you think are doing this well? Is there a model that you look at?
Oh gosh, and I've had the fortune to travel a fair bit throughout the world, and I look at, like, just when we talk about dietary guidelines, and Brazil is not necessarily killing it as far as health is concerned, but if you look at their nutritional guidelines say, don't eat a bunch of ultra processed food, cook meals at home, eat with people you love, try to stick to single minimal ingredient food. That's literally their dietary guidelines. Whereas you look at the US, it's like 10% saturated fat and no more than this much added sugar and this much fruit and vegetable. And it's very prescriptive. And I don't think that's helpful. So I think something along those lines where we have to realize that we just need to eat whole nutritious foods. And I think that would help. That would go along, whether it's carnivore or vegan or whatever. I think that would go a long way to help a lot of people. I think, you look at like the school systems in Europe, like France, and their canteens, they serve kind of whole natural food. And if you look at, I think France actually, I've seen like the obesity rates in France have actually gone down over the last 20 years, which is a shocking trend compared to some of these other places. Now France has its own problems and there's a lot of issues there, but I think Italy, is talking about their banning. Some things make me happy, banning like lab grown meat and, some of this plant-based nonsense that's going on with that type of stuff. So I don't think there's anybody I guess you could look at like places like Monaco, but I mean, you've got so much wealth there. I mean, it's like, that's part of the key to longevity and health, is just being wealthy. I mean, as you probably know, that's one of the probably the biggest discriminating factors. Super wealthy countries, people live longer. So we have sort of that. And so I think that, you know, bringing people out of poverty is going to be a huge benefit to overall health. And that's obviously a multifaceted thing that has to happen. But I can't think of a, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, because you're in Dubai, and there's obviously a lot of wealth there. I mean, it's kind of a weird system because there's this underclass in Dubai. I don't know if you.
I don't think Dubai is unique in that regard. I just think that's human society. It manifests in different ways in different places. I mean, there's parts of the USA that I'm amazed that I'm in the USA. Like, it looks like worse than a third world country. And then there's other areas with extreme affluence. The concept of how wealth and poverty affect this are really interesting. So I'm from the UK. So in the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are all poorer countries than the USA, statistically. The UK is, I mean, salaries, the USA has way more wealth than the UK, but the UK's life expectancy is like 5, 6 years higher. So all of these countries have like a 5+ year greater life expectancy than the USA does. So the link between sort of, obviously at the extreme poverty end, that massively reduces life expectancy, but there seems to be this weird thing where I don't know. As nations become richer past a certain point, it can lead to greater wealth expectancy, sorry, greater life expectancy. We see that in some places in pockets, but there can also be this overcorrection where obesity gets so high. And perhaps, I know in the US, the amount of drug use, both legal and illegal, is gigantic. Over 100,000 Americans per year dying from drug overdoses and drug poisoning, which is 5 times the rate in the UK, for example. Not 5 times as many people, but 5 times the rate per capita. Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of bizarre. And I've even heard that when it comes to life expectancy, that even when you control for um, obesity and other, let's say, more obvious health issues, there's still like a 2 to 3 year penalty in the USA when it comes to life expectancy. So there's something that's, and I think we've hinted at a lot of it in this podcast in terms of the food and what people are actually consuming. But I find the US like a really interesting country in this regard because it's it doesn't necessarily track, some of the data doesn't really track with what it should be, given the GDP and the wealth of the country and the level of development and the technology. Like the life expectancy for men in the USA should be like 84, 85, but I think it's about 76. Whereas somewhere like the UK, it's around 80, 81.
Yeah, yeah, we're definitely behind in that regard, and I think that there is if you track like ultra processed food consumption, because in the U.S. I think we're something like 60 something percent of our food is coming from ultra processed foods. Those things will have an impact. Obviously, our obesity rates are much higher than the UK's and for most of Europe for that matter. And so
I wish it was much higher. It's not that much higher. But actually, I do. Do you know something? I do know. I spend a lot of time in both countries, and I will tell you something that I've observed, which is that the obesity rates in the UK and US are not that dissimilar. UK's UK's a little lower than the US, but it's maybe about 5%. But the people in the USA who are obese are often way, way, way more obese than the people who are obese in the UK.
yeah, we see this super morbid obesity. These people with BMIs and 50 plus. Yeah, you don't see that because, and I think I mean, and I don't know if you try. And I've not been there, but I've been to Asia a few times, but not been to Japan. But apparently, like in Japan, and the obesity rates are something like 3 or 4%. I think Vietnam has the lowest obesity rate in the world at 3%. But in Japan, they don't accommodate obesity. I mean, if you are morbid, you don't have clothes. They just don't make clothes for you. And here in the US, I mean, they just facilitate. I mean, we see all these people talking about we need to widen the planes and you go to the hospital waiting rooms, there's all these jumbo wheelchairs and there's, you know, 5X, 6X, 7X clothes. And, I remember as a surgeon, I would have patients coming to me wanting these mobility scooters because their knee hurt because they were obese. And I would just say, no, I'm not going to, because I felt that as a way of actually harming the people eventually. Because in the U.S. we facilitate and create obesity, whereas that's just not like I remember my wife's from France, and I remember taking her mom around. Her mom was pretty old; she was in her 80s, and she needed a wheelchair. And I think I was in Bruges in Belgium, and trying to go into these restaurants, and there was no like handicap. I literally had to lift the wheelchair to bring her in there because you just don't accommodate that stuff. And in the United States, we're so good with the American Disabilities Act and all this stuff. We want to accommodate. But by accommodating, we're actually creating. Like I said, if I've seen this. Some people say that like in some countries they don't have back pain. It's like, why doesn't back pain exist? Because there's nothing to do about it, so they just don't talk about it. It's kind of interesting that we've kind of almost facilitated and created all these sick people because of the accommodations. And again, it's a touchy subject because you don't want to harm these people, but at the same time, if you make it easier for them, and this is one of the things that I worry about. And Elon Musk talking about everybody's going to have 3 robots in their house, and they're going to be doing the dishes, and they're going to be cooking the meals, and what are the people going to do? They're going to turn into these Wally characters where you just sit around there and turn into these giant blobs. I don't know. I don't know if that's what the future is going to hold. I mean, it's kind of scary to think that we might. I mean, maybe we'll all be out there exercising and running and playing and hiking in nature, but I worry that we're all going to be sitting there staring into our Oculuses playing video games with our sex dolls while robots run the world. I mean, is that where we're going? I don't know.
Do you know where I think we're going, Shawn? and I've said this on many podcasts, is I just think humanity is going to bifurcate. I think you're going to just see a division like we have never seen before in human history. You're going to have yeah, you're going to have a percentage of the yeah, you'll have a percentage of the population that's exactly what you just described, and then you'll have another segment who are perhaps healthier than, you know, healthier and more creative and more entrepreneurial and more flourishing than ever. You're going to have people who are just like kind of plugged into the matrix on a whole other level, and then, you know, perhaps not even really living in the real world. And then you'll have the other people who are, I don't know, more conservative, let's say, who are just kind of living the way humans have lived for most of history.
It's like you watch one of these old Star Trek episodes where like Captain Kirk goes and he goes to a planet and there's like the really ultra advanced people and then there's the savages, out there living in the wilderness. And the savages are kind of happier because they're not dealing with all this stuff. But, I think that um, this is the thing about the United States. We are clearly a wealthy, resource-rich nation. One of the of all time, of all history, right? And to me, the fact that we have all these obese, sick, disabled, depressed, dependent people is just it's an awful testament of what we could be. I think it's like with all the technology and resource and mental uh, resources we have, we should be a society of flourishing, physically fit, active, kind of athletic population. I mean, there's no reason we couldn't do that given the resources we have. It's just, again, it's a matter of who's being incentivized, right? And again, we have this huge incentivization process to prey upon all these sick and weak and obese, tired people. Again, I think we should. Hopefully, we can turn it around. Hopefully, we're at an inflection point with what's going on politically. I don't know. I'm not gonna sort of put all my eggs in the government basket. I think it's got to be a grassroots movement, and that's what I've been sort of kind of pushing people to do is to sort of you got to solve this problem on your own. And I think it's growing. I'm sure you're aware of it. More and more people are quote unquote waking up and no longer woke, but they're waking up to some of the nonsense that's occurred. And I think some people will turn it around. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but it's going to take a lot of work and effort on everybody's part.
For sure. Well, I think the best we can do is our best. That's what I aim to do, and that's what I encourage everyone else to do. It's just like with the knowledge, resources, expertise, talents that we have, let's all just do our best to serve our fellow people. And we don't have complete control of it all, and we never will, and we can't. So, we do our thing, and we're certainly going to influence and impact some people positively, and some other people are going to go in another direction. And I guess we'll see how it all plays out. But Shawn, I love your work, man. I'm glad we finally got to have a conversation, and there have been so many nuggets of wisdom here. So keep being awesome. I love following you online. Really interested to see what you continue to do in the future. So thank you for the gift of your time.
I appreciate it, Zuby, and I appreciate your positive message. You're a very positive guy online in a world where there's a lot of infighting and negativity. So keep up the positive message.
I do my best, man. And last thing, where can people find and follow you online?
So I would like folks to check out Revero.com. I think that's really helpful if you've got medical issues. So that's important. Revero. I'm on X now, S Baker MD. I'm on Instagram, Shawn Baker 1967. I'm on YouTube and Facebook. And what's the other one? TikTok, Shawn Baker MD. So those places where you can find me.
Any dances on TikTok?
I haven't danced yet. I probably should start doing it. I think that's going to sell. I'm not doing very well on TikTok. I'm not the dancer guy.
Shawn, thank you so much, man. Great to talk to you.